Hello, my name is Nicholas Furnival. You are listening to or watching an OSW podcast. Today I'll be interviewing Dr Maria Domańska, an expert from OSW's Russian department. We'll be discussing the state of Russian politics. Can Russia be described as an authoritarian country or perhaps totalitarian? I want to start with a very big question. Why did Russia invade Ukraine?
So Putin has for many years been dreaming about some kind of restoration of the Soviet Union's international position. And he pursued two main goals. First was to restore Russia's influence and control over the so-called post-Soviet area. And Ukraine has always been treated as the jewel in the crown. And Russia has always perceived the so-called post-Soviet area as its natural sphere of influence, of unique political clout. The second goal was to discredit and marginalize NATO, which is presented as Russia's not only adversary, but recently also mortal enemy. So the aggression against Ukraine was intended to show that NATO is toothless and cannot react in a proper way, and that Western countries should be afraid of Russia.
Could I ask, if NATO is supposed to be Russia's mortal enemy, but Russia wanted to demonstrate that NATO was toothless, how much confusion was there in the propaganda?
In fact, Russian propaganda is not cohesive at all. I mean, it sells to the people sometimes totally self-contradictory versions of events and interpretations. And I would say that the principal goal of this propaganda is even not to convince people to one cohesive version of events, but to overwhelm them with hyperboles, with fear, with panic, with very strong negative emotions, to sort of zombify people. I mean, to deprive them of any ability of critical thinking. So I think the Kremlin's dream is to have just a nameless, unified mass of people, passively listening to what the authorities are serving them.
Okay. And how much do these perhaps not yet nameless mass of people accept this propaganda? Are they as passive as the Kremlin would like?
Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what Russians think, but judging by their reactions, yes, they follow the pattern of a passive society. But I would like to underline that this is super pragmatic, in fact, because for over 20 years, Putin kept showing to the people that any kind of resistance, any kind of opposition is futile and can carry harsh repression. So people just decided to pragmatically adapt to very bad circumstances. And also they have embraced some kind of paternalistic vision of the state and the relations between the government and the public. So people usually say, we don't know much about big politics. We don't want to judge our government because they know better. So this "they know better" defines to a large extent the actual stance of the public en masse. But of course, there are still some people who try to oppose the war, who try to oppose Putin. Many of them, I would say at least several thousand of them, have emigrated over the last year or something from Russia. They were forced to emigrate because they faced direct repression, or they realized that under repressive laws they cannot continue their, for example, civic activism anymore.
Would you say they've given up, or they are trying to regain their strength?
They haven't given up, definitely. It is the first wave of Russian politically motivated immigration that is quite determined to stay in touch with Russia, to keep contacts with the Russian public, and they continue their civic activities. Also, the opposition activities abroad, trying to rebuild the structures of the civil society and political opposition outside Russia. And this is really some new quality, but of course they are functioning in quite difficult conditions, not only because they need funding, they need to rebuild everything, sometimes from scratch, but also because maintaining contacts with the Russian public is more and more difficult due to the wartime censorship, due to the growing repression. In fact, all contacts with Western entities, Western governments, Western organizations abroad, or the so-called fifth column, the people who oppose Putin and emigrated and work with Western NGOs, for example,
So wait, Russia's fifth column is external now?
Russia's fifth column is both. Russia's fifth column partially has emigrated, and Russia's fifth column partially still remains in the country. And all of these people who try to save somehow the remnants of grassroots democracy, let's say, all of these people are treated as the traitors of the state, traitors of the nation.
Could I say treated as traitors by the government and how would the general public think of these people? Would it be, would they face ostracization?
We can only judge by the surveys of public opinion. And of course, we should approach them with a pinch of skepticism, because these surveys are being conducted under the wartime censorship. For example, it's forbidden to ask about people's stance towards the war. The question is about special military operation, which totally blurs the core of the issue. But people, unfortunately, are more and more buying this propaganda narrative about the enemies of the nation. For example, we can judge by two surveys conducted before the war and last year, I think, or the beginning of this year, people's attitude towards foreign agents. We know that a lot of civic activists and Russian NGOs were designated foreign agents.
So these foreign agents, they can actually not be foreign. They can be Russian citizens.
They are uniquely Russian citizens, because for foreign entities there are other repressive laws, like, for example, the law against the so-called undesirable organizations. But as regards foreign agents, these are only Russia-registered NGOs or Russian citizens who are under foreign influence. So this is really very broad definition. Any single person showing any signs of opposition towards the anti-democratic course of the government can be designated as a foreign agent and put on a special list. There is now well over 500 entities and people on this list. And there are all kinds of administrative burdens, and it's very easy also to pay huge fines for breaking the very repressive and harsh regulations. So people, unfortunately, believe to a larger extent than before that foreign agents' laws are really against bad people who want to do some harm to the fatherland. And this is worse than it was before the war, because before the war, quite many people still believed that the law against foreign agents was principally intended to suppress the opposition.
Okay. I wanted to ask a question about this passive nature of Russian citizens, because I read something that you wrote about a survey which said that 58% of Russians would support a new attack on Kyiv, but 70% would support a peace agreement. Now, with my mathematics, that's 28% will support anything at all. So, I mean, how do we understand this?
Well, simple mathematics usually doesn't work 100% with surveys of public opinion in general, but here we have, I think, at least three factors. First is this is the typical double think. I mean, people believe simultaneously in two contradictory things. And this is partially a legacy from the Soviet Union, we may say. Second, it's just the overwhelming feeling of being powerless. People know that they cannot influence the events. So this paternalistic approach starts to work. The government knows better. We will support any decision by the government because they know better than we what should be done. What is positive about it is that more people would support peace agreement than a new attack against Kyiv, but this is very limited optimism, in fact. And the third factor, and I think it works in quite many cases, is that it's not our business at all.
Could I ask, though, because if you say more people would support a peace plan than a new offensive, is the Kremlin going to pay any attention to this public sentiment?
I don't think so.
Oh.
The Kremlin strongly believes that it can shape freely the public attitudes, and unfortunately, the reality proves that these guys are right. People are under the overwhelming influence of the state propaganda. Around 2/3 of Russians still say that their principal source of information is the state television, which is totally for propagating this aggressive war, these aggressive war narratives, presenting the whole world, not the whole world, the Western world as enemies and Russia as a besieged fortress.
Are people going to this source of information because they really are interested in the information, or it's simply better to know what we're supposed to believe?
I think sometimes it's just an unconditioned reflex because everyone has a TV set at home, so it's just easy to switch it on and listen to the news. Some people, of course, try to find some independent information, but here we are starting to navigate through troubled waters of cognitive dissonance because all nations, of course, want to seem good, and nations in general have problems to admit that they have done something bad to the others. So a Russian citizen, if they reach to independent sources of information, they learn a lot of bad things about their country, their nation, their government. And if you get this kind of information, you somehow feel pressed to do something about it, but they know they can't do anything about it. So a sort of a cognitive dissonance immediately emerges, which is quite painful and disastrous for your psyche. So it's sometimes better to pretend you believe the cohesive version propagated by the state television and just forget about all kind of inconvenient information. And here we are getting back to this double think issue, I think.
War is peace.
War is peace, exactly.
Okay, so I'd like to move on to, which is connected. The big question is Russia authoritarian? Is Russia totalitarian? And which is the direction of travel at the moment?
The direction of travel is quite disheartening. I use the term Russian neo-totalitarianism. Because in some aspects it resembles the classical version of totalitarian regime that we remember from Soviet times, for example, and in other features it's qualitatively new or different. So this is a highly oppressive regime that encroaches more and more into people's private lives. People are being severely indoctrinated everywhere. Also, the education system is a powerful lever of this indoctrination, from kindergartens to universities, literally. Also in kindergartens, also in kindergartens. The repression is really growing. It's not like mass terror, but still it is not that you can show any signs of opposition and not being punished. Up to certain moments, there was a sort of authoritarian social contract. I mean, the government used to discourage people from participate actively in politics. So stay away from our big politics affairs, but we will not intrude too much into your private lives. That has changed. And this totalitarian tendency can be illustrated with law against the so-called LGBT propaganda. So it's not illegal to be gay in Russia. It's illegal to talk about it. It's illegal to actively defend the rights of the LGBT people. And it's illegal even to mention LGBT people in literary works. And some literary works have been removed from Russian libraries and bookstores.
This is quite new literature, I guess, or...
This is, for example, Haruki Murakami, who some were mentioned, these people. So this is a trend. We have a personality cult of Putin as a leader, a savior of the nation, a savior of Russianness and Russia. And of course, we have this massive propaganda that doesn't leave any space for pluralism, I would say. But also, this new type of the regime is a bit different from the classical version of totalitarianism, in a sense that this is Russia with still open borders. I mean, people can emigrate.
It's very open, in fact.
Well, people cannot freely emigrate in every case because it also depends on your individual situation. But roughly, it's quite possible to freely emigrate from Russia if you are not happy with the regime. Also, there is no leading ideology, no cohesive ideology we remember from Soviet times, for example. Putin's so-called ideology is rather a mix of often self-contradictory messages, all kinds of conspiracy theories, and just some propaganda cliche, which change.
Could you give me an example of some of the conspiracy theories?
For example, that the West has always been striving to destroy Russia and been orchestrating all kinds of plots to disintegrate Russia, and the West is vitally interested in the disintegration of Russia, which is totally to the contrary, because in fact many Western leaders fear possible disintegration of Russia, feeling this destabilization of the whole region of Eurasia. Another fascinating conspiracy theory is the one about the Western conceived biological weapons against the Russian ethnos. It was presented on the state TV many times that, for example, there is a special species of mosquitoes infected with this biological something, and the West is testing these biological weapons, including the mosquitoes, in Ukraine, and that there were some kind of biological laboratories in Ukraine where all kinds of biological examinations were taking place to produce these mass biological weapons of mass destruction against the Russians. And from the scientific point of view and political point of view and every other point of view, it's a total hogwash. But seriously, the Russian propagandists spread this kind of conspiracy theories.
And how does the public react? Are they just simply passive, as you said, or do they believe it could be true?
Well, some of them surely believe it could be true. But as I have said, it's extremely difficult to really understand what Russians actually think. I'm pretty sure that many of them just laugh listening to such news. But we cannot say to what extent it remains afterwards at subliminal level of your way of thinking, and to what extent it really builds somewhere inside the people this anti-Western beliefs. The difference between the current phase of Russian oppressive regime, this neo-totalitarianism, and the pre-war one, is that the government tries to actively mobilize people around the flag. So there is a top-down expectation, encouragement, or intimidation to make people actively take part in all kinds of pro-Putin rallies, pro-war rallies, anti-Ukrainian, anti-Western rallies. Children in schools and kindergartens dressed up in military uniforms and made to take part in patriotic performances. There is also another totalitarian thing, which is the so-called patriotic education in schools and in kindergartens and in universities. So pupils and students are being taught that the West is Russia's enemy, that the war, which is not called the war, but special military operation, is the right thing, and that the leader is saving the very core of Russian identity, because the West wants to destroy not only Russia, but also Russian identity as such. So this is very totalitarian. But as I have said, we have open borders. We have no leading ideology. We also don't have a single party. We have a personalist dictatorship, in fact. We have a deeply criminalized state, which is also another important feature of Putin's regime. So this is some kind of mix of different features taken from different political regimes, and this is all happening at the time when we have well-developed, advanced digital technologies, which only makes things worse because we have a mass surveillance of Russian citizens with the use of all kinds of digital technologies. It's mostly employed in the largest cities, but it's being developed by the secret services and the government. So, for example, if you take part in an unauthorized political meeting, they can find you after 1 year using all kinds of face recognition devices and cameras and punish you for taking part in an illegal rally. So this is the atmosphere where Russians operate, function, and live every day. And these are the conditions and atmosphere where some of them still try to somehow convey a message to their fellow citizens that Putin is the worst evil for Russia, and the war is not right, but this is a crime, and so on. And these people are usually severely punished for that.
Okay, so it's a very dark scenario, but there are people saying Putin is Russia's enemy, the people's enemy. When does Putin leave? How does Putin leave? Do we have to wait until he reaches 90 years of age, or is he ill? Is he weak?
We don't know. We don't know because this is top secret information about his health. Of course.
But is he weak politically, for example?
Politically, he doesn't seem to be weak. I mean, we from outside, we notice some symptoms that he doesn't control the whole situation in Russia, and from time to time, here and there pop up some either small social protests, or we get this feeling that the large part of the Russian ruling elite is in fact against this war and is deeply frustrated. But Putin maintains a capacity to keep them under control. And they still fear much more Putin than Western sanctions, than the long-term consequences of this war. They are losing their money due to the war, but the fear that Putin's secret services are listening to them and can reveal all kinds of plots in advance is so strong that actually I don't see any readiness among them to start some kind of collective action. And to see some kind of collective action being undertaken, I think that people within the elite and people in Russia in general should see total defeat of Putinism as a political project, as an aggressive political project. And for that, we need two things. Russia's unambiguous defeat in Ukraine and a deep economic crisis. The necessary minimum would be to make it impossible for the government to replenish their military potential. But, well, for them...
Because otherwise they would start another war?
Because otherwise they will continue this war endlessly or start another one. That is why I don't believe in any kind of peace agreement with Russia unless Russian troops are pushed out of Ukrainian territory, all the occupied territories. Because any kind of peace agreement without a total military defeat of Russia in Ukraine would mean that...
Including Crimea?
Well, I think including Crimea, because precisely the West's lack of reaction for the illegal annexation of Crimea was the beginning of this war, in fact. So after Russia signs a hypothetical peace agreement without previous total defeat in Ukraine, they will only gain time to build up again their military potential and to attack again. And then there would be a big and open question whether the West be determined enough to oppose Russia so resolutely once again. Whether Ukraine will be able to fight so resolutely once again. We need a comprehensive, total reconstruction of Ukraine. The problem is that in the West, it's still a taboo for many people to even think about Russia's total military defeat in Ukraine. And it's even a bigger taboo to think that we as the West, to guarantee sustainable peace in Europe, we in fact need political liberalization in Russia, which means that we need a regime change, not only a change of leadership, but also a regime change, which is impossible, I think, as long as Putin is alive.
Well, I wanted to ask precisely about this. Let's imagine Putin isn't alive. What happens? Do we know the name of his successor, or do we know the political leanings of the successor?
Of course,
will it be better?
Well, we don't, and Putin also doesn't want to reveal any names. Because in this system, he knows that he has built this system and he knows it better than anyone else. So he knows that once he announces the name of his successor the next day, he can be just neutralized. Let's put it in this euphemistic way. So we don't know who could replace Putin, but I'm pretty sure that there will be people eager to do it. And I think that no one worse than Putin can come to power. This is another false belief in the West. Many in the West fear that someone worse than Putin, like Ramzan Kadyrov, like Yevgeny Prigozhin, could come to power. I don't believe it.
And you don't believe they could come to power, simply?
I believe they can have some ambitions, but to come to power effectively in Russia, you need to have a support of the larger part of the elite. I can't imagine Russian elite supporting Kadyrov or Prigozhin. They will have their own candidates. And my understanding is that after this disastrous war, and I think the majority of the elite understand pretty well that this was a huge mistake to start this war. So after the war, or after with the war ongoing, but with some crucial political changes on the horizon, I'm pretty sure that rather a compromise figure will be chosen as a new leader. Because I also guess that
But would this compromise figure be simply chosen from the elite or elected in free and open elections?
Well, at the initial stage, I think he will be chosen by the elite. And I'm also pretty sure that the elite will be interested in choosing someone who wouldn't be able to become another dictator, because I think they are fed up with dictators. But it's very much up to the West to then influence the course of events, because at the first moment it's quite obvious that this person will be just chosen from within the elite. But then some kind of free election should be organized. Without that, we'll see Russia again deeply in the authoritarian path dependence. So I think that the West has a toolkit to influence the future Russia's leadership, because this leadership will be automatically much weaker than Putin.
Are we talking about like a Marshall Plan?
No, we are not talking about the Marshall Plan, because we first and foremost need a Marshall Plan for Ukraine.
Okay.
Period. Russia will have to cope by itself economically. And I'm actually quite optimistic as for Russia's future economic prospects, because independently of the creeping nationalization of Russia's economy, there are still enough elements of market economy. And I think that the situation won't be similar to that in the early 90s, when there was a total collapse after the demise of the USSR. We will not see anything like that. But what the Western should do, the new leadership will need to only build from scratch its domestic and foreign legitimacy. So we could use this element to exert pressure on the new leadership, to make them organize free election, release all political prisoners, revoke repressive laws. In other words, we cannot, of course, intervene in Russian domestic affairs, and we shouldn't even think about it. But we can create some kind of a framework and keep it open as long as needed for domestic forces, for domestic political competition, for democratic politicians, for Russian civil society, to try to build another Russia and to do away with the remnants of Putinism. Of course, this process will be extremely difficult and nonlinear and bumpy, but it should start at last.
Okay, one final question. There are some people who are worried about what could happen if Russia disintegrates due to the chaos caused by this war.
I don't see many premises for Russia's possible disintegration, in fact. I mean, defeat in the war and even deep economic crisis, it won't mean automatically that Russia will disintegrate. Russians are extremely pragmatic. And if there is some kind of political, economic, social upheaval in Russia, I think that Russians will, first of all, try to focus on their everyday affairs and try to survive. And I don't see much potential for separatism in Russia, even in the so-called national regions or national republics where national minorities live, because they lack strong political elites who could be a driver for this separatist movement, for example. Russia, which is officially called the Russian Federation, is in fact a highly centralized unitary state. And regional elites don't represent the interests of the regional populations. They represent only the interests of the Kremlin. So they cannot represent people on the ground. And they are also not freely elected, of course. They are nominated by the Kremlin, in fact, although elections are organized from time to time. So people, in fact, don't see much connection with their official representatives. Also, the whole system of budgetary economic relations within the state is constructed in a way that regions are deprived of any kind of economic independence. So they give almost all their money to the federal center and then get donations or other kinds of budget transfers. And they cannot freely decide what they should be spent on, for example. Also, there is no signs, so far at least, of any kind of strong regional ethnic national identities. If we put aside the narrow circles of local intelligentsia or civic activists or opposition activists, people on the ground usually don't have this strong local national ethnic identity. And this is also a result of long-term deliberate policy of the Kremlin to uproot somehow these regional identities, because the Kremlin, Putin himself, remembered the 90s when there was this famous parade of sovereignties in Russia, where Yeltsin told the regions to take as much power as they can carry. So to prevent the disintegration, for the last of 20 years, Putin successfully, unfortunately, conducted this policy of hyper-centralization and unification. And also there is...
But could the clock be turned back 20, 30 years? Take as much power as you can carry?
Well, they could, but that would require a very complicated, long and bumpy process of fundamental renegotiation of all kinds of center-regions relations, which will take time. But during this process, people would need money to feed, to function somehow at a basic level. So they will need the Kremlin, they will need Moscow as this center of distributing budget transfers. But with time, of course, the demand for greater autonomy can grow. But I think that we should stop falling into this pitfall of false beliefs that once Putin is gone, something really disastrous can happen to Russia. I think to the contrary, because the key to success, the key to have a more predictable and less aggressive Russia is to empower Russian citizens. Because the main reason, in my understanding, why Russians are so passive and they passively support this kind of aggressive, repressive regime is that they feel totally disempowered. And it's quite pragmatic and realistic assessment of realities. So once we create conditions where Russians can get political agency, and there is actually a big demand among Russians everywhere for example, local self-governance. Once we give them this opportunity, I think that we will be able to cure all kinds of evils at the same time. Just to give you one example, if national ethnic minorities in Russia feel empowered again, if Russia becomes a true federation with power decentralized, devolved to the regions, these ethnic and national minorities can become a powerful vaccine against the possible revival of Russian imperial revanchism. Many people talk about in the internal colonization of Russia, in a sense that national ethnic minorities feel oppressed by the Russian ethnic majority, which is inside itself quite also complex. It's not like we have 80% of Russians, period. It's much more complicated. So we also, in the West, we don't actually notice all kinds of these complexities in Russia, Russian cultural, ethnic, language diversity. If we think about Russia, we usually think about white Russians ruling in the Kremlin. We think about Putin. So I think this is one of the biggest and most detrimental, dangerous also myths that we still cherish in the West, and we should get rid of this, in fact, colonial mindset we express ourselves.
So, Maria, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And to our viewers and listeners, if you enjoyed what you heard, please like the content and subscribe.